Good afternoon. This is John Solomon with the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, or CyAN. Welcome to the latest in our series of videos where we host interesting people across the global information security space to discuss relevant and timely topics to our industry and areas of activity related to us. A bit of background, CyAN is an originally France-based but global not-for-profit trust community of very experienced, well-networked information security, risk management, policy, and related experts, consultants, managers, and other stakeholders in the sector across the board. And part of our series of activities involves giving a platform to initiatives that we believe further the cause of maturing the global information security space, supporting data security, resilience, robustness in society, and generally creating more capability across all areas of cybersecurity, information security, whatever you want to call it. A little bit of background to today's video before I introduce our guest. We started last year an initiative under the CyAN banner called the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition, or GFCRC. And we're going to mention a lot of concepts and links in this talk. I'm going to put all of these in the video description below, as well as any LinkedIn posts that are together with this video. The GFCRC was founded to support and amplify the recommendations of the OECD Digital Economy Working Party to legislatures and policymakers across the G20 governments to implement legal protections for cybersecurity vulnerability researchers and responsible disclosure. This is a massive topic. This is something we'll discuss in a bit more detail. And basically, the issue is that a lot of usually well-intentioned computer misuse acts and computer fraud acts provide a basis for either criminal prosecution or civil lawsuits against responsible, well-meaning vulnerability researchers. Now, the global information security space, not least of which is critical industry across the world, financial services, healthcare, aviation, whatever, relies on a dependable flow of information about new vulnerabilities. Back in the dark ages, when Microsoft did not yet have, for example, Patch Tuesdays, it was very, very difficult for companies to get access quickly and dependably to a new critical issue when somebody managed to find it. And as a result, very often companies were caught with their trousers down, causing huge amounts of unnecessary damage. This has improved, but unfortunately across the world, we still have a lot of gaps or a lot of older laws in place or legislation that doesn't provide sufficient protection for well-meaning, reputable, responsible researchers and ways for them to communicate things that they find, software bugs, vulnerabilities, security holes, to people who can fix it, and also people who could make sure that these get fixed, whether governments or consumers or industry itself. With that as background, I'd like to introduce our guest today. Inti de Ceukelaire is a Belgian vulnerability researcher, very experienced, a big name in the sector, works with Intisoft, no relation as I was educated. And I first came across Inti on LinkedIn when a colleague of mine linked to a post he made announcing the recent Belgian Safe Harbour rule, which came into effect in February for protection of vulnerability researchers. To my knowledge, the Belgian law is the first of its kind in the developed world that explicitly provides safe harbor provisions for responsible researchers. And we want to talk a little bit about that today, about giving some ideas about what are the gaps, what are the backgrounds, and getting Inti's thoughts on not only where the industry is coming from, but also where it's going and how we can all work together to make this a more robust and safe environment for communicating vulnerabilities for everybody's benefits. So welcome, Inti. If you want to give a quick introduction, who you are, where you're coming from, and why this topic is of interest to you.
Absolutely, and thank you for the introduction. So my name is Inti de Ceukelaire. I'm from Belgium, and I've been an ethical hacker since I was 14, 15 years old. I'm 27 now, turning 28 soon. So I've been doing this for a while, even though I'm still relatively young. But still, in this period, a lot of things happened in this space. And for me personally, my personal life, I've also had some hiccups and some roadblocks along the way of becoming an ethical hacker, let's say. So I tried to be very vocal about that. 10 years ago, what we're doing right now was illegal. If you, at least in Belgium, even if you were well intended, even if you did not have any criminal intentions, and that basically completely turned around. So that was a very interesting journey because I was able, at least in Belgium, to do my part and to be a piece of the puzzle to get to the point that we're at. And I think it's a great reminder for people that, who knows what may be legal in 10 years from now that is maybe now frowned upon. So I think that was quite a nice experience for me. During the day, I work as a chief hacker officer at a bug bounty platform called Intigriti. We have about 70,000 hackers worldwide, and we connect them with companies to essentially find vulnerabilities in a safe environment.
Excellent. Thank you for the introduction. Now, I'm a little bit older than you. Actually, I'm a lot older than you, but let's not talk about that. So when I was in university, I didn't have a clue, honestly. And I wasn't doing anything information security relevant because there was no such concept as information security back then. The reason I got into this field was, reading Cliff Stoll's The Cuckoo's Egg. And, we were trying door handles at government VMS boxes with password protection, stuff like that. And obviously this has evolved significantly since then, but, you mentioned that you got started doing this when you were 14, right? I
Yes.
that for you, it was just a personal, rather than saying, hey, I'm going to go find something and become rich off of bug bounties, you were interested. You're a hacker. You're a classic hacker. You're trying things, trying to break things, come out.
You got to be motivated. And I think a lot of people want to get into the space, but they have the wrong motivations. They think that they can earn a lot of money quickly because they see that people that have been doing this for years may get a bigger bug bounty payouts, and they think, okay, within a week, I have some programming knowledge, I can do the same. And I often see these people failing. For me, that was not really the case. I just wanted to cheat. I started, like a lot of youngsters, I started by cheating in video games. And I always loved cheating, but not in relationships, but more like in games. The thing is, I think it's very often frowned upon, and there's like also some kind of ethical cheating where basically you're not really harming the players, but you're just doing it like for yourself. You're making sure that you're not really influencing any leaks or whatever. Well, that was the same for me. I just wanted to mess around with some stuff, and I wanted to bypass some restrictions of the game, maybe to go to areas where I shouldn't be in the game to kind of explore it. So that's how I personally got started, and I think many people got started. But there comes a point at the cheater that you're just playing against the other cheaters, and then you can no longer win. So that you have to, like, when all the cheats that are available to the public are, used, and everybody's you're on the server where everybody cheats anyways, you still need a way to win. And I think that was those are the nicest gameplays that I had. Like rooms full of cheaters, because you know that you could define the rules and you could rewrite the rules. And then it was all about creativity, and it added like this extra layer on top of the game. And that's what motivated me.
It's kind of a cheater aquarium.
A cheater aquarium.
So where everybody is, it's like, people say, well, when
oh yeah.
It shouldn't take steroids or performance enhancing drugs. But why do we have a separate Olympics for people who are taking just performance enhancing drugs? Because then we are up.
Yes. Yeah, the cheater Olympics. I would love to see that. It's where the creativity starts happening, I think. I mean, nothing against the normal game players, but it's also sport itself. But I just love, I think as a child also, because I also love to cheat in offline games. I just like games you would play at school. I think as a child, you kind of grow up and you're confronted with all of these rules. People tell you all the time, you can do this, you can do this. But some of these rules are silly, and we're just expected to accept them. And when I grew up, I had the tendency to maybe question some of the rules or to find creative ways around them that I would still follow the rules, but typically like still get what I wanted. And I think actually it's more like a mindset. And then I basically at that point, after that, I came in touch with technology, And that's when I went from a live hacker to a computer hacker, let's say. But I always had some kind of hacking in me. And I was about 40 years old when, I started programming, and I started to have fun online, not only with games, but also with websites and applications.
I totally get that. If I mention messing around with Doom 2 wads, people are going to really want to put me in old people's home. But, getting double-barreled shotgun with infrared ammo and rapid fire, for me, it was really just, I can't get any further playing normally. So I just want to see what the hell's behind this door. So I think that's kind of part of it. And I also got to say, I really come from the traditional definition. I believe in the traditional definition of hacker, as in not just somebody who is breaking into systems, but somebody who is trying to probe the limits of technology and using it for ways it wasn't intended to be. So in that sense, that definitely resonates.
The internet would not exist without hackers. I mean, almost everything in a way started off as a hack. So yeah, I think it's that kind of creativity that we need. And honestly, a lot of my peers, when we started doing bug bounty I was one of the first users of many popular bug bounty platforms. I was early to the party, just being at the right place at the right moment. And it's nice to see that a lot of people that I started with, I mean, that was a friendly, competitive space. We built our own tools because in bug bounty, you only get a reward for a vulnerability if you're the first to find it. So you had to do some automation, you had to be creative, etc. You had to focus on stuff maybe the rest was not really focusing on. And it's super nice to see that a lot of people have now established, created entire companies from the recon tools that initially they wrote for bug bounty. So these are now actual cybersecurity scanners or frameworks, or maybe even asset management software pieces that originally started off as just a bug bounty tool to win from other people. And that's the kind of competition I think that we need. If there's only so many big enterprise software vendors to go to for security, you will get less competition, and we need challengers. And I think hackers are the perfect challengers.
This is important. I come squarely from the industry perspective in this regard, and having run a fairly large bank's software application security testing and general security assurance team, you rely on a reliable, consistent flow and timely flow of vulnerability information. Now, obviously, there's always that trade-off between, well, give me a chance to fix it first, but do let me know about it, especially if I'm affected. And basically, industry would be dead in the water without having a relationship, I'm going to say, among the good guys, the white and the gray hats, like yourself, who will, through whatever means, get them this information so we can then go ahead and fix it before the bad guys go and find out. Because the bad guys are going to go find out, right?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. But yet I do also feel that there's different kind of company. Maybe luckily now that the changing legislations, there will be less and less of these, but that basically that they put their head in the sand, because some of these organizations, and now of course with regulations, like I said, this happened less frequently, but especially back in the days when I would find vulnerabilities and contact companies about that vulnerability, I would get zero response. I would maybe get to a support engineer that wouldn't care to even forward it, or I would, show it to the CISO, and they would kind of, just remove the email, because they also knew back then, okay, any type of vulnerabilities that I accept and learn about now become my problem. I have to pay for somebody to get that fixed. And people like you, of course, you like to, you strive to have the best security for whatever company you work at. And you, of course, are very welcoming for vulnerability reports. But in my career as an ethical hacker, unfortunately, I've seen many companies that simply didn't want to know, didn't want to hear about it. And even recently, this weekend, I reported a critical, you can't believe how critical these vulnerabilities are that I reported last weekend. I submitted it to 10 different companies without a bug bounty platform, by the way. So they did not have a bug bounty program, but still it was something that I could find in a legal manner. And I got one response back It's now Thursday. I sent it over over the weekend, and that's a little bit silly because those are the types of vulnerabilities even that could close down a business. It's such an impactful vulnerability. I don't think they care.
And by the way, just a quick side note: this is a Microsoft bug out. Please patch. Just in case you're listening to this. Yeah, this resonates, and I think if you believe HackerOne, I think one of their figures is something like 40. I think they say 42 or 43% of companies don't have a vulnerability disclosure program. Even there's not even a channel. Now, I don't know what their methodology is, and if that includes your neighborhood trucking firm or grocery store or just the big ones, but it's still shocking. Anecdote from my side is back in 2003. I was called frantically by a friend of mine to help him build up an incident response team. Whatever the hell that was at the time. There were no incident response teams, right? This is the dark ages. And what had happened is he had been brought in to do a system security inventory by their management. And on Wednesday, on Friday, he reported to them saying, your estate, your Windows and your Unix estate is a mess, right? You're in for some trouble. And I think the next Tuesday, Code Red hit, if you remember that. Some of you will.
Yeah.
They just went down flat, right? Because they basically said, yeah, go away, kid, you bother me. Fine. Don't annoy us with this because this costs money. Tuesday, he has blank check, right? And he calls me and says, I have no idea what I'm doing. John, come help me. I didn't know what I was doing, right? But this, I think, is the unfortunate reality that a lot of companies, they only really start thinking about, well, how do I even bring in information about new vulnerabilities, let alone creating a process or a capability where someone like yourself can actually go and report these, whatever the motivation is, so that's I think is a big one.
Yeah, also because at that moment, if somebody external is involved, you're exposing whatever process you have internally, you're exposing some of the information to that outsider. And I've seen huge enterprise companies having the worst kind of bugs you could imagine, like Steve is a STEM, like literally like being able to execute code on their production server, being able to query all customer report accounts, for example, so really bad. And then still it would take them multiple months to get something addressed. And if I'm a customer, because sometimes it happens that I'm a customer of one of these companies as well, it's frightening. You can't really call them out for a year, because then you're especially in trouble, because now they can just start bullying you with a lawsuit. Oh yeah, but you want to complain? You hacked in the first place, or you found a vulnerability in the first place. We can sue you for that. So I do think that the industry in general simply needs more transparency. But a lot of companies don't have the incentive, or at least the traditional companies don't have the incentive to create that kind of transparency around these topics. And that's, I think, why it's important that there's new legislation that kind of force companies to be open about things like these. Like, if you have these processes, please do outline them. If you have a bug bounty or responsible disclosure program, please make sure that we can find it. Or if you decide if you do not want to work with people like me, still state that on your website, so at least your customers can find out how you're dealing with security.
So I think you mentioned one word that's really important in this, and that is sue. And what we're talking about is not only criminal penalties for researchers, but also potential civil legal trouble, especially in jurisdictions like the US or the UK. Is very, very painful for, if you're a 20-year-old university student or even a commercial researcher, if you get sued by an industry giant. And you have a lot of public relations and legal teams who may be thoroughly well-meaning, but they don't understand that it's counterproductive if they now go and sue somebody. We've had plenty of cases like that, where somebody, I'm not going to name any names, but somebody basically said, hey, look, I've got this vulnerability, and he was shut down because a company legal team said, well, we're going to quash this, and if we silence this person in court, it'll just go away. It won't go away.
And typically it blows up in the face. Once people start involving the press, like it tends to get very messy quite fast. But like with these lawsuits, I mean, I've been in one, honestly, like over 10 years ago now, where also I responsibly disclosed a vulnerability to a company. And yeah, they sent the police to my house, and I was taken in for questioning. And the whole case took 5 years in total. And eventually by then, in those 5 years, a lot of things happened. And I was advocating for ethical hackers, and I was lobbying with certain politicians, etc. And at that point, 5 years later, the judge also ruled like, look, according to the law, I mean, the complaining party has a point, but she said, like, if I see what this person did, like, this was very well intended. And I think that kind of changed the story as well, that sometimes if you're in luck, at least in Belgium, and that was a good sign for me, some judges can be compassionate and understanding about this. But what I don't like about this is that it's a gamble. You never know who is going to rule, because for the same, she could also have decided to put me in jail for like 5 years. That would be the maximum sentence for disclosing a vulnerability to a company that didn't really ask for it. So I knew that the law had to change, and luckily now that happened in Belgium. And funnily enough, so the day that it changed in Belgium, and that hacking without authorization in Belgium, but of course with well-intended hacking, became legal, I kind of framed my criminal records. And a week later, I started, reporting bugs in the government without permission, but hey, it was no longer needed. And then the Prime Minister sent me a T-shirt, or the office of the Prime Minister, as a thank you for disclosing a vulnerability in your system. So I'm going to frame that T-shirt next to the criminal record, because I think it's a piece of art, really. It's like, what can change in 10 years? 10 years ago, it gives me,
yeah, that's excellent.
Exactly, yeah.
And this is actually another good. You mentioned all these really good points that make me think of related topics. I just yesterday had a call with a German academic team from one of the big university security programs that's doing a study on web vulnerability research. And one of the gentlemen in that team made a really good point, which is that essentially, unless the legal situation is clear, you're at the mercy of the individual judge or prosecutor, or even the law enforcement official, the potential police. And when you get into an environment like, for example, in the US, where you have your federal, your state, your local jurisdictions, and there's a lot of leeway in interpreting the law at all these levels, unless there is a consistent, clear, set of rules that you as a researcher can follow, you can run into trouble, even though as in your case, you're well-intentioned. And that, I think, is a really good segue into talking briefly about the Belgian law. Because, one objection that I heard about, well, let's talk about the basis of, one of the can you talk a little bit about what I think this is the December 2022 update for Safe Harbor. Can you talk a little bit about that, what that change, background was for that?
Okay. So the very first change to the ethical hacker laws, or the hacking laws, that essentially originated from the 90s in Belgium. So it was back in the days that I got in trouble, it was based on legislature from the 90s. The first change that was made was kind of to allow certain individuals with permission to test your system, because before that, hacking would be a crime regardless of a complaint. It's like murdering somebody. It's not like somebody would need to file a complaint for it to be illegal. Hacking was exactly the same. They changed the status of hacking to be like, okay, you have to have, it's illegal, but only in certain circumstances, and you would still need to have authorization. That also changed now in December, where basically they said, and I think this is also allowed to kind of push people to have a responsible disclosure or vulnerability disclosure policy. Basically, if you're a company, you have your computer systems in Belgium, of course, because it's only the Belgian jurisdiction that can acquit you if there's any charges. Then basically, if you as a researcher can prove that you've acted ethically on doing vulnerability research and responding or reporting vulnerability, they have no legal grounds to sue you for that anymore. If they would, they could try, but the judge would say, okay, we're not going to even start the procedure here, because it's seen as well-intended hacking officially. Now it needs, in order for that to work or to qualify, let's say, you need to follow a couple of rules. And right now in the first iteration, there's a lot of these rules. I hope that in the future, there is the process will become a little bit more efficient, but I'm already grateful that there is a process in the first instance. So what is this process? And I've been through the process multiple times already. If you find a vulnerability, you have to let these people know as soon as possible, like within 72 hours. You have to communicate all the details. Yes.
Though, right? There's the Center for Cybersecurity in Belgium that you have to report to, or is it?
It depends. It depends. So if you have a vulnerability disclosure policy on your website, there's no need to also inform the government about it. Because in Belgium, you could say, oh, if you found a vulnerability in a Belgian system, you have to inform the government. Almost sounds like China, right? Where basically if you find a 0-day, you also, the government is entitled also to know about it. Well, it's not entirely the case. If you have your own policy or procedure in place and it follows these rules, the hacker or the ethical hacker no longer has to report it to the CCB, to the government. So that is an important nuance. And I think personally, it's done deliberately by the government to push people towards these CVPs and these responsible disclosure policies, to encourage them essentially to do it themselves. It's like, okay, if you don't want to set the rules, Belgium will set them for you essentially, but then you have to live or abide by them. If you want to set the rules, fine, but you got to be transparent about it.
I think this was that was voiced quite a few times, and I think probably based on at least a partial misunderstanding that you had to report everything to the CCB, and it's not the nature of a lot of, let's be honest, a lot of people who find vulnerabilities that they're going to want to do this. So that's I think an interesting distinction. So if a company has a disclosure policy, then the researcher does not automatically have to send it.
Yes. Exactly. So if the company enforces safe harbor themselves, that can be seen as a binding, agreement, let's say. And the CCB itself, I believe, only does this to protect the people if they have records of them reporting it ethically. And I just always put them in CC for companies that I didn't have the authorization to test for. I know that, the CCB will also kind of have my back. If it goes wrong and if the company is upset by me finding something in their systems, there's still a record that is not on my computer that I couldn't fabricate, but it's like an independent system and they can keep track of it. It's also important, I think, that sometimes the government can see or learn about plans that would affect a lot of Belgian citizens. So I don't think it's necessarily bad, but if you want to take that private as a company, you can simply by implementing this policy. So I don't see that there's a big problem in the requirement to report it to the CCB if there is no policy present.
A tip, a sincere piece of advice from the adults with experience to our younger viewers. What Inti said is really important. Putting them in CC, it's called cover your ass, CYA. It is really important. Always cover your ass. Leave a paper trail. Dag, I just wanted to bring that in there, a little bit of wisdom. Please go on, though.
Yeah, but absolutely. I fully agree. And of course, there's still some rules, right? You cannot really do everything that you would like to. You cannot, for example, physically do any physical intrusions. You cannot, for example, start to pivot. You cannot social engineer employees. You should also not do any damages. For example, if you're starting to run like active scanners on targets that send a lot of requests, that would not qualify or not be eligible for it, because then, of course, you can take a system down and that would potentially result in financial damages for that company. And then they still, of course, would have a base to sue you if you're like hitting them with well-intended DDoS attacks all the time. It's not, no judge is going to approve that. So I mean, that's pretty straightforward. Also, you should respect the privacy of users. If you're in a system, for example, you can read emails or you can see details of individuals. Sometimes it's inevitable. Sometimes you have to, especially if you're testing on production, if you cannot have multiple test accounts, which is the case, for example, for a lot of government entities where you have to log in with your ID. If you want to test something at a given point, sometimes you may have to view the private details of a citizen. If there's no other way around it, that's okay. But then you also have to list whose personal information you viewed, and then basically they can start a procedure around this. And then also you have your eyes covered. what you cannot do is, of course, iterate through all the citizens' details. That would be excessive. That's not totally not needed to prove your point. And at that point, the company could say, okay, but this person kind of abused their access. So you still have to act ethical. It's unauthorized testing, but you still should limit everything and the potential damages to a minimum and respect people's privacy.
Regarding the personal record, I think there's the argument to be made, even though this has not yet been tested in any judicial precedent, that one of, I forget which of the GDPR carves out as 36 article, I forget which one, actually covers the access to personal identifying data if it's in the interest of protecting the organization. So I'm assuming that somebody at some point is going to make that argument, even if it's not explicitly covered by a vulnerability disclosure law like this.
Yeah. Yeah, so we get the question quite a lot, even in bug bounty, and sometimes this may happen. And companies may be afraid, okay, if somebody finds a vulnerability and sees maybe accidentally, for example, you visit an unprotected admin page that shows PII, what do you do with it? Is it a GDPR breach? In that case, if it's an ethical hacker, of course, that you know and that you have an agreement with, and basically participating in a program like that can be seen as an agreement, it's not an official GDPR breach. So you don't need to report it, etc., yada, yada, yada. But then, of course, you should have a very clear policy, and that really underlines the importance of a policy again. If you work with a platform provider, you have your ass even more covered, because we will check the identity of everybody, so we know who everybody is. We have like an agreement with them, terms and conditions that they have to accept, stuff like that. And then basically it can be seen as an authorized test, and you won't get into trouble with the data protection agencies, unless, of course, that there's been an indication of excessive misuse, but then it wouldn't be ethical hacking in the first place. So
it also presumes that there is a mechanism in place to somehow protect this information. I mean, the classic example was in 2021 in Florida. Okay, granted, it's Florida. Then we'll say no more about that. Sorry to our friends in Florida, but a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch right-clicked on his browser on view source for a state government webpage, and revealed 100,000 social security numbers, which are the pension for our non-American friends as well. And the then governor, who was, this was Missouri, not Florida. My apologies to my Florida friend. I used to be in Florida. I believe the Missouri governor wanted to prosecute this guy under I don't remember exactly which Computer Misuse Act, because this simply, view source on a website and having 100,000 pieces of confidential information show up is not in any way violating a protection mechanism. You're not breaking anything. You're just,
Yeah, exactly. And it's sometimes a very thin line, and it's funny that you mention it, because this is one of the go-to examples that I use in my presentations as well, to show that the line between what's ethical and what's not, and what is protected and what's not, is really thin. For example, pressing F12 on your keyboard and revealing in like confidential information. I think nobody would see that, except maybe for the governor, as protected information. But for example, in the case of an IDOR, and for the people that are not technical, what is an IDOR? It's like an insecure direct object reference vulnerability. What it is, essentially, sometimes when you order something, let's say on Amazon or another web store, you see like your order number in the address bar. Like after you've ordered, you see your personal details, you get your PDF invoice, and it says webshop.com/order/ and then maybe a very long number. What if you put another number in there, and maybe instead of number 500, take number 430? In some cases, for some websites, they do not properly check if that invoice would belong to you, and it would actually show you that invoice with all the details of that client that actually ordered that invoice on. All you're doing is changing a number in the address bar. Would you say that it's protected? Yes or no? Because according to the law, or to certain cases that already been to court, this is actual hacking. And the difference between actual data being shown in the HTML of a web page versus, okay, let me just change the number in the address bar, is not as big. But apparently for some lawmakers, there is the line. And I think it's, it can be quite fake. We walk the line all the time. I feel like Johnny Cash, essentially.
Well, I mean, we've thankfully, I think we're seeing increasingly a new generation of lawmakers come in that are more digital natives. I hate that term, but it's true. People who have, I think I'm the last generation that had to transition to the internet as a fact of life. And yours is one of the first generations for whom it was the starting point. You grew up with this right from the start. And who understand these things a lot better, who are more comfortable with the terminology, the concepts, the tropes, the ideas, and are not going to apply traditional, wrong think to digital vulnerability research. Now, one thing I think pops up here a lot, and that is good intentions. In our good faith. Now, my understanding of the Belgian law is that from the CCB website, condition 2, you must act without fraudulent intent or design to harm. Now, that's a really nice sentiment, right? My question is, that's subjective. And
That's very subjective.
Announce yourself beforehand. Is that something that could potentially use a little bit of refinement, or could that potentially cause an issue at some point?
Yeah, I think for sure the intentions or intention to do harm or whatever can always be seen as something that is. Let me give you an example. The company back then in 2014 that I hacked, they probably thought that I wanted to harm their reputation, like harm their PR. The only thing that I wanted to do is reveal a vulnerability in their systems. And eventually it would end up, because of their own misdoing, it would end up actually causing them some harm in the press. But that's not on me, really. There was still some harm done, but then these companies, they may think, okay, but yeah, you're trying to discredit us in the press, while all you're trying to do is really trying to get some critical information across. So I think it's like for things like these, it's always very hard, especially if you already do not have the best relationship with that company. They may think that you're like targeting them. The first question I got from some journalists after the law went into effect was, okay, so who's on your hit list? Who do you want to learn a lesson, essentially? And I answered like, if I would reveal that list to you right now, I wouldn't be able to conduct any tests on them, because these companies could say that I've been creating a hit list of people, that I want to show what they're worth, or, show that their security is total rubbish. And then that company, that statement could be taken by a law firm as, malicious intent, because I targeted them.
And I mean, there are doubtlessly people out there who have, who are sociopaths or angry or whatever, who do this for, as you put it, malicious intent. But the vast majority of security people of any kind either have neutral or good intentions, and it's really the bad guys are either the hardcore criminals we weren't talking about, or the exceptions. Now, my question is a semantic one here in this regard. Is the burden to show fraudulent intent by the researcher on the, I'm going to in quotes, victim, the target, or is the researcher to show absence of fraudulent intent?
So I did ask that question as well. That was one of my first questions I had for the CCB. And they did say that you are responsible to keep records of everything that you do in order to prove that you've acted ethically. But of course, I think the nuance is there that if the company cannot hold anything against you, logs or anything else like that could indicate that you've been fraudulent, and you can only, and this is important, that you always collect evidence, even if you think that you have your ass covered, always collect the evidence. I have a special folder for it, where I basically, after I do a night of recon, a night of testing, I basically write down what I did and what I tried, just to keep my own records to go back to, but also later, if there would be any misunderstanding, that we can go back to it. And I would recommend it for everybody. But indeed, the burden is on the actual hacker to prove that they've been that they've been well intentional. However, I do think that if it would ever come to an actual court case, they would also kind of expect a company to come with a very good reason as to why they would sue somebody for responsibly disclosing something to them, because at that point you have a lot of evidence. You have the email to the CCB. That's again why it's important. You have the email to the actual company in CC, and you have to fill in the form as well where you clearly state your actions. So if there's something missing from these actions, of course, and you didn't fill it in completely, and the company says like, okay, this person says they did this, but in reality, they create much more data than they should have, and actually find the data in your computer, I guess then you're in trouble, but then you're no longer in the ethical hacker. So it is still important that we do enforce some kind of rules, also to protect these companies. But I think where it's going right now with the law is it's a good path. We're not there yet. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. But I also want to be proud, as the small country as Belgium is. Many people don't even know where to point it on a map, or where to find it on a map. I'm just happy that for once we did something right, and now we can start working on refining it.
And listen, kids, listen to this man. He speaks wisdom, paper trail. As my lawyer always tells me, never assume anything. Even if you're manually writing down what you're doing in a diary, write it down. I can't stress this enough, because you're going to need this. Even if you mean well and somebody coming after you is not fair, life isn't fair, and it's only going to help you avoid harm. Now, regarding the Belgian, the legal change, another area I've seen objected to is this is what I want to circle around to from before, is the lack of protection against civil lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
Right? My understanding, again, my understanding of I speak neither Flemish nor, well, my French is probably good enough, but is this something that you think is going to be addressed, and how do you view the potential for a civil litigation against?
I think it's difficult, because I think companies should always be able, in my opinion, to have at least a procedure to investigate whether somebody, or maybe not by going to a court, but there should always be means to mediation. I think a lot of these problems, they start with a misunderstanding, and there should be independent parties where maybe a company could also go to and explain the situation, and, for example, say, look, okay, this hacker, they think they got an access token, and we resolved the vulnerability, but we saw that the access token from the same IP address was used on this and this and this date. I mean, there should always be a process for companies to voice these concerns. I think that's the best way forward. But of course, there's not a lot of real protection against these hackers right now. And I do think that as we progress, like the burden should really be on the company as well. And we should, whenever something like this would happen, right now it's like more behind closed doors that something like discussions like this would happen. But nobody really benefits from it. I think if, as a company, you believe that absolutely you have the absolute right to go after a researcher, because, I mean, it may happen that they did something that shouldn't happen. I think that door should still be open, but then you should be extremely transparent about it, and you should have the guts to communicate about it, and to just make your case publicly, and have some independent parties review it. And that, I think it would also address some of the more lawsuits that are not there to necessarily win, but just to drain money from people, because that's, of course, what can still happen. Companies would know that maybe they wouldn't win, but they can still make it very inconvenient for the reporter, and maybe that's their goal. And that is indeed something where I think also initiatives like yours, but also funds to support researchers dealing with these lawsuits can really help. Good causes that can support them with legal advice, maybe to cover some of the potential fees or fines that would come with it.
That's an important one, and that's actually one of the objectives of the the good faith coalition is to not necessarily create good standards and resources, because these are already out there to a large degree. But for you're a university student or a young professional or small company, to help you find out whom do you go talk to, whether it's the ACLU in the US or the equivalent in Europe or wherever, if you run into this situation. Another interesting approach I found is something like the gold standard safe harbor initiative, where you're actually trying to get companies to voluntarily buy into, safe harbor provisions, and basically say, look, we will not go after in civil suits vulnerability features under these and these conditions. So I think industry is increasingly understanding the need to be less stupid about closing doors.
And there's also public perception, right? Because a company that is a multinational that has most of their servers located in Belgium, there's still a loophole for these companies, right? If you were to sue from a different country that you're operating in, obviously, you're also located there. And if you can prove any damages that would occur to that part of the business, then technically you would be able to sue somebody from outside of Europe. But still, it's, I think loopholes, lawyers are always going to find loopholes. And I guess if you want to sue somebody, it will always be possible somehow. But still, this is also very important to shape the public perception. And what I've seen from history is that the public perception is a weapon that, if you have it on your side, is the best tool to win any lawsuit and maybe even do more damage to the suing party. And I believe that if you're a Belgian company now that tries to pull off that trick, the Belgians will know, and they will learn through the press, and people will call you out on that. So the potential PR damage of now suing somebody, even though maybe it's still possible if you found a loophole, just became like 10 times as big. And that is maybe even more important than the actual legislation, because like hackers gonna hack, lawyers are going to find holes in legislation, and that's just a never-ending story. I think the public perception, you can change.
I think also, though, in especially Europe and other liberal democracies under Napoleonic law, without going into a discussion about which system is better, common law or Napoleonic, we also have the additional, I'm going to say, layer of protection of judges who are expected to be experts, as opposed to jury trials in cases like that, where you've got 12 people who may not be the most informed, ruling on a very, very technologically sophisticated case. And I think this is actually a good closing statement about, because I do want to draw attention to the OECD's recommendations. Now, the Digital Economy Working Party, their whole objective is to create a consistent set of rules and legal protections across particularly the G20 countries, but to avoid these inconsistencies that could result from having different legal frameworks. Right now, we have, I think, the Americans. I'm going to say the Dutch have always had a fairly good, constructive approach to vulnerability disclosure, but I don't think it's explicit like the Belgian one. But the Americans, I think, led the pack in May 2022 when they said the Justice Department will no longer prosecute good faith researchers under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Now, this is not the same as creating an explicit legal safe harbor, not harmer. But it's a very good start, because it shows that somebody is recognizing the problem and understands that it is up to governments to put these protections into place, hopefully more and more, consistent and stronger as we go forward, so it cannot be subject to new governments reinterpreting the rules. So I want to thank you very, very sincerely for joining me today. Do you want to say anything to wrap up? Any maybe words of wisdom to young hackers and industry, things to watch out for, or to lawmakers?
That's a good question. And by the way, thank you so much for having me. I think when I started doing this, I was kind of reckless. I was defining ethical how I thought it was, and I did make some minor mistakes, I think, looking back at my career.
You're basically saying you were a teenager.
I was a teenager indeed. And I think looking at the way that technology in the world is changing right now, we will have even more of these challenges in the future. Think about AI, think about other things that actually, instead of having to think about these regulations in 10 years, 20 years, when maybe the wrong people have gone to jail, we got to start thinking about this right now. And I think, especially for the younger people, you always have the best understand. Like, I'm finding against the generation of judges that didn't get it. I will, at a given moment, be one of them, and then you, the younger generation, will have all the knowledge about the latest technology. So it's super important that you do not let the old people decide on the policy making, and it's important to keep on advocating for your cause, even though it may seem like helpless, because it's not going to change very fast. Eventually, if you are with enough people to fight for the same cause, look what happened with ethical hackers. 10 years ago, I got a criminal record. Now I got a t-shirt. And maybe in 10 years even, I got a...
I don't think we could have a Marcus Hutchins today. So that's go,
yeah.
Go vote, get involved, please. So it sounds we're always telling you the same thing, but it does matter.
It absolutely matters.
Thank you very, very much again. As mentioned, I will link to your LinkedIn profile, to Intigriti, to all the stuff that we discussed in this channel, a whole bunch of things in the video description below. I invite anybody who is interested in this topic to contact us. Please like and subscribe. Check out our other videos, the usual YouTube stuff. And with that, Inti, really congratulations, and I'm happy to see that especially Belgium is I think leading the charge on this kind of sensible policy design, to no small degree thanks to the efforts of people like yourself. And let's hope this takes root in a lot of other countries. And thanks again for joining me.
Absolutely, I'm rooting with you. Thank you.